Really?
And we'll just need to get that back to
So we'll pass the mic.
slide mode. 'Cause right now it's in, there you go. And I have an hour, is that right? Hey.
I'm going to introduce you.
Oh, just make up a story. You've heard me talk so much.
It doesn't mean I don't want to introduce you. Did you meet Vanessa?
I did. We go way
Okay.
back.
Since like 5 minutes
Yeah,
ago?
yeah,
All right. I wanted you two to meet.
yeah.
Vanessa's a rising superstar.
Yeah, no, I like already where she's headed. I
Yeah.
like what she's talking about.
Yeah. How long are you in town?
I'm here until the 27th.
Oh, you are?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, because I have to deal with the,
Yeah. Okay.
But I'm here, so I'm
Good.
around. So if you want to have
Yeah, I will
dinner or
hang out.
something,
Are you staying in Hollywood?
I am staying at my dad's house
You are?
after tonight. I decided not. Took the offer to stay in a hotel so I can stay
Great.
focused on this. And
Yeah.
not get into my dad's
Well, we
headspace.
can definitely hang out
Yeah,
this
yeah.
weekend if you want.
Yeah.
Okay.
That'd be good. That'd be
Go to the
nice.
beach?
Yeah.
All right. Day two, we can review, but not today. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our second session today. See you again, as I met you this morning. And I have the pleasure of my very good friend, Dr. Walters, and an alumni of Triple Bruin. They're not looking at them, but we like to say thank you, Karina, as so study here with Rosina, Sarah, and she earned her bachelor's here for studies and doctorate. So we're very proud to have Karina. Dr. Walters is a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Professor, scholar, and Washington School of Social Work. And she's the principal of Dr. Walters is going to talk to us about her journey, how she ties her personal experience. One thing that I want to tell you is she's one of the few athletes really focused on balance. A lot of people talk about why cultures don't fare well. And what Karina has done in our field about the basic culture practices, courage, wellness, help each other, also want to give
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I have to stand, I'm sorry to stand behind the podium because I have to touch this to make this move. Otherwise, I'd be out there more with you. But first, let me just say, greet you the way I would traditionally. Halitosa hachifat hatapushi kanchanspo chibichi hoyo michachatas yohoke micha yokoke okla tongva micha yokoke Rosina, Laura, our leaders for today. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I just greeted you in our language, which is Choctaw. I'm an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I'm going to talk a little bit about that story and my experience with respect to that, my tribe and a project that we've been doing there. I also wanted to pay my respects to the Tongva people whose land we are in here. And I'll do a little bit more of that in a minute and tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. If I talk too fast, it's because I've had lots of coffee and I hold Dr. Rosina Becerra responsible for that. No, but just wave your hand and I'll slow down. So that's no problem, okay? And if you have a question, please, we're a small group, let's ask away. I am going to talk a little bit about social justice and community engagement through a project that I have. I'm going to talk a little bit about perspectives and ways of thinking that are not what you're going to normally get in most schools. But first, acknowledging my ancestors. I bring my ancestors with me here, and the ancestors of this land greet us in this way. And my people originally come from Okla Inhalada, or the people of Moundville, ancient chiefdom in Alabama. But you guys didn't know about Moundville, Alabama. But we were there, at its height at about 800, year 800, right at it. That's the pinnacle of its height. So I can, oh, what's happening? Come back, okay. So those are my ancestors. We were a great society. And this is Cahokia, another Moundville peoples, Mississippian peoples, ancient village site. About 70,000 people lived in this area. It's just outside of St. Louis. If you ever get to St. Louis in Illinois, it's right in that area. And so I bring this up because, being born and raised here in Los Angeles, I get called an urban American Indian, and people always kind of approach urban Native issues as if, oh, it's so sad, you guys are urban. And I'm like, we've been urban before. We had major cities, but the difference is living within US settler colonialism and the impact that has had on our communities. So I just bring that up to kind of punctuate a little bit how I'm going to be talking about settler colonialism and its impact on our peoples. This is Nanawaya. It's our ancient mound in Mississippi where we originally say we emerged from the earth. Again, just acknowledging my ancestors. I descend from Anicha Hoyo, and that's her brother. He was a Chief Mashalatabi, my grandfather, and all my relatives, my mom. And then also on my dad's side, I also have Native ancestry on my dad, but I call him a white guy because he does identify as a white man. He's primarily Welsh, and myself. So this is who I bring to the table. My daughter, she's Alaska Native. So she's Yupik and Athabaskan from Alaska. Those are her tribal people. And this is one of her grandmothers there. And acknowledging the Tongva. And if you have an opportunity, and if you don't know, there are sacred springs that you can go visit. That's not far from here. That's actually on the campus of University High School, right off of Barrington and Sawtell. And these are ancient springs. The community has since guarded it and created ceremonies related to it. But this where we sit at UCLA. This was a place called a place where we are in the sun. And this is really exciting because for me, we are also considered sun people, for the Choctaw people. And so, yeah, this is a beautiful area here, very large village here. As you can see, several thousand years ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the processes around community engagement and the work that we do, but I'm going to talk within the elements. So I'm going to break it down into four elements. I'm going to talk through water, land, air, wind, and fire. And so I'm going to first start with water. And so here, let me put this up for myself. So I want you to take your water, and I want you to think about your water today. And this makes sense because we're so close to the sacred springs here. In Indigenous ways, we talk about water. You might have heard water is life. And when you think about it, The majority of the world is water. The majority of our body is water. We're literally birthed from our mother's waters. So water is everything, right? And we're taught water is medicine. Water is our first medicine. So when you take that sip of water today, I want you to think about your relationship to water, because it's in you, it's of you. It's medicine that you carry. And where does water go? Water just rises up to the heavens and it returns right back down. So when I take this sip of water each day, my lips are touching the water, the same water that my ancestors' lips touched. In that way, every time I take a sip of water, I'm directly connected to my ancestors. In this way, when I take care of the water, I'm taking care of the next 7 generations, my great-great-great-grandchildren's water. In this way, we're all connected, right? And same thing with traumatic experiences. It's a kind of a parallel process. There are things that we still are connecting to or carry that's connected to the experience of our ancestors. But when I talk about some of that, I'm going to talk about historically traumatic events and how we think about that in relation to community engagement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. But I don't want you to think about just the trauma of historically traumatic events that our communities have experienced, because we're not defined by the trauma. We're defined by the ancient instructions, our original teachings that our ancestors carried in their hearts, that we carry in our hearts today. That defines us, not the traumatic events. These were events and they happen and they've had impact, but they don't define us in terms of who we are. Okay, so in this moment, I am my great-great-great-grandmother's granddaughter. In this moment, I am my great-great-great-granddaughter's grandmother. In this moment, I am all those things. If I take action on behalf of my health and well-being, I'm not just impacting my own health or my family's health or my community's health, but I'm impacting the next 7 generations' health. As a matter of fact, I have an opportunity to take corrective action and correct some aspects of what my grandmothers and grandfathers couldn't fix that I still carry in me right now. In this moment, that is not about disempowerment, that's actually about power. So when I talk about historically traumatic events, I want you to think about power. It's about power, it's not about disempowerment, right? The other thing is I want us to think about vision. As a Choctaw person, okay, I am a descendant. The Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, we are not originally from Oklahoma. We're originally from Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana area. The federal government forcibly removed us. We're the first tribe to be removed on what's known as the Trail of Tears. And we survived it. Most of us did, a lot of us did not. We lost thousands perished on the trail. But Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, we are all the descendants of those who survived the Trail of Tears. That's who we are, right? And my grandmothers and my grandfathers did not walk that trail for me to not be living healthfully now. They walked that trail and the hardships and the death with a vision of love and life for us. So my responsibility in this generation is to reconnect to that vision of love and life. That's a vision they held for us. So we have an opportunity to reconnect to that. And that third element, when I talk about historically traumatic events that I want us to keep in mind today, is what I just said, love. Historical trauma and recovering from historical trauma in our communities is actually about love. It's not about getting caught up in the drama of the trauma, but it's about reconnecting to love and life that our ancestors carried for us and reconnecting to those teachings that helped us live well and healthfully, not with only ourselves and our bodies and our families and our communities, but with the world, the earth, all of our environment, all of the beings of the environment. So that's what I want you to think about today when I talk about historical trauma: power, vision, love, these 3 elements. So I'm going to give you some examples of that. Most of my work, I'm just going to share with you just briefly, is informed by looking at, and we were just talking, Vanessa and I, about social and cultural determinants of health and well-being. Some of our major historical determinants of health are these historically traumatic events that we've been impacted by. And these are just some of the examples I'll talk briefly about. And also the everyday discriminatory events that we still navigate and negotiate in our world, because we live in a world that is not healthy. And as we navigate those things, what helps us do well, despite those events, right? Family, culture, language, connectedness, all of these elements are really important protective factors that buffer the impact of those kinds of traumatic events on our well-being. And when I say our well-being, I don't mean just our individual well-being. I don't mean just separating mind, body, spirit. Those things are not separate for us. It's your whole person, and your whole person is tied to the land and to the environment we're in. It includes the land, it includes the environment, because these things are integrally connected. We have a saying in many of our tribal communities across the world: I am the land is me. Which is very different than the settler colonial perspective, which is I own the land is mine. Right? Very different, very different perspectives. I am the land is me. If you attack the land, you're attacking my body, because our body is made up of the land. You're attacking my spirit, because our spirit is tied to Mother Earth. There's all of these different ways of thinking. So talk a little bit more about that. Most of my work is focused on how do these kind of traumatic stressors impact our well-being, and how they literally get taken up in our bodies and in our communities at the community level as well. And I'll talk a little bit about the project that developed out of that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about settler colonialism and what I mean by that. And I'm talking specifically about United States settler colonialism. To set the stage, because you guys are international, we have over 574 tribes, American Indian, Alaska Native, federally recognized tribes in this country. We have at least 200 other state recognized tribes in the country. We have over 200 distinct languages that are spoken that are not understandable across, so it makes unity very difficult for our tribal communities. So we don't, it's not like in Aotearoa where everybody shares Maori in terms of the language. Everybody's Maori. They just have different clans, different iwi tied to different places and land. It's easier for people to come together and address the government. For us, much more difficult. My language cannot speak Navajo. Navajo don't, we wouldn't be able to understand each other. Our tribes developed universal ways of communicating and these kind of universal languages as a way to communicate, but they were still regionally connected. Okay, but settler colonialism. So settler colonialism basically consists of the policies and practices that facilitate two things: native land dispossession. It's all about the land. It's always about the land. And what did I say? I am the land is me, right? So it's about land dispossession and erasure of native people from the land. And the purpose of that is erase to replace. Erase indigenous people from the land, whether it's through genocidal policies or through just rendering us invisible in the American imagination. That erasure serves a purpose. And one of the purposes it serves is the opportunity for the settlers to replace their stories into that space to justify ongoing settler occupation, as well as freeing future generations from guilt or accountability. So there are stories that are put in place that we've all been taught in the United States. All of us have been taught these stories. So I just want to say it's natural, as I'm going to talk about this, some settler anxiety will come up for us because this is the stuff we're not supposed to really talk about. So we're making visible the invisible. The thing is, settler colonialism is a structure. They are not events. And I think that's a really important piece. So when we talk about US settler colonialism, we're talking about structures that are supported by different kinds of thinking, like manifest destiny or the doctrine of discovery. And I know I'm introducing some things now, and it's a whole other kind of area for you to explore while you're here. But these are created to distort historical realities, free future settler generations from guilt and accountability, rationalize and normalize continuous occupation and rights to continue to dispossess Native people of their lands. Just think recently, DAPL, the native pipeline issue and water, this is a great example of that. And then simultaneously erase us from land, contemporary society, and social discourse. That is kind of the purpose of settler colonialism. But what's the impact? Well, the impact, I already talked about erasure, dealing with invisibility. A lot of people don't know about Native issues. A lot of people don't know what land they situate themselves in the United States. Land acknowledgements are starting to come around. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We are still dealing with land dispossession, but we also deal with distortions of history and the disavowal of ongoing past and ongoing colonial violence. There's a constant disavowal. And then Tuck and Wang talk about this, Eve Tuck, in terms of there are strategies, and we see it even down at the social work level, right? We call them settler moves to innocence. When we get anxious, when these stories come up that make us anxious about Indigenous history and Indigenous oppression and so forth, people start to get really nervous, right? And part of that nervousness then activates something called settler moves to innocence. It's the way we try to strategize to, reconcile that anxiety that we have and try to create a sense of, well, quite often it's manifested as equivocation, or, well, that was those generations, but that's not my generation, those kinds of conversations, or an over-identification with oppression so that you can distance yourself from the power and privilege that you continue to hold. And we see that a lot in social work, right? So all of that is about unsettling. And part of our work as social workers as we continue to unsettle the settler colonial practices that we all have been exposed to. But the impact, I think Eve Tuck captures it really well here. She says everything within a settler colonial society strains to destroy or assimilate the native in order to disappear us from the land, right? This is how a society can have multiple simultaneous conflicting messages about Indigenous peoples, such as we're all dead, or we all live in faraway remote locations with a buffalo, right? We live on reservations, all of us live on reservations, that contemporary Indigenous people are less Indigenous, as if non-native people can determine that for us, right? Blood quantum is a good example of that policy. That's an imposed policy on our communities. And that the best part is that all Americans are a little bit Indian. So if everyone's a little bit Indian, then, we can't possibly be oppressing or have, the settler colonial thing still happening, right? So that's the narrative that we kind of deal with in contemporary society. So so now, how does this connect to, how do we unsettle critical consciousness and social justice? So I'm going to throw a little something out there just to kind of unsettle a little bit. Eve Tuck talks about this actually in her article called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. If you haven't read it before, I really encourage you to read it. And basically, she challenges the notions, she challenges Freire and the idea of critical consciousness. Not that it's not important to have that, but it's what Freire doesn't do that she troubles. And what Freire doesn't really do is he doesn't really say who the oppressed are and who's oppressing, right? And she says it invokes a settler fantasy of mutuality when we don't really begin to look at that. And he doesn't talk about natives, he doesn't talk about settlers, and that's unlike Frantz Fanon, who was talking about native and settler society. So, so the future becomes just simply a rupture from a timeless presence. So she challenges, she says, settler colonialism is absent. That absence serves a purpose to maintain settler colonial structures. And so she challenges us to think about that, but she says, but I don't want to discourage you from critical consciousness because that's one component, but it's not the end all be all. Simply raising critical consciousness, addressing power structures does not automatically follow, certainly not for settler colonialism. So she says, we're asking you to consider how the pursuit of critical consciousness or the pursuit of social justice through a critical entitlement can also be a settler move to innocence, a way to disavow or disconnect or relieve the settler feelings of guilt or responsibility, or actually conceal power and privilege. So I'm just going to throw that out there just for you to kind of think about in terms of our practice. So we You know, we have to think about the models that we think about. At first, we get excited about because it talks liberation. We get excited about that, you know, and it's our first, it's an important initial hook, but is it deep enough? Has it gone all the way? And for me, as a Native person, I would say, unless it includes US settler colonialism, it has not gone the full distance. We can't talk decolonization without talking about US settler colonialism. Everyone's all like decolonizing. I'm like, really? What does that really mean to you? Because I can tell you from Native communities, it does not mean the same thing quite often of what's espoused. So how does historical trauma play out in this, right? How do these historically traumatic, how many of you have heard about historical trauma? Have you heard about that? Yeah, so these, now it's confusing because the literature talks about it sometimes as a response, a historical trauma response. I'm talking about it as events. These are historically traumatic events and they serve a purpose. What they serve is to uphold settler colonial structures. So it's not enough to look at the event without looking at settler colonialism. It's not enough to look at US settler colonialism to see how events are actually tied to help perpetuate settler colonial structures and systems. So these events are actually specifically designed to do three things: eradicate a people completely through genocidal policies, eradicate lifeways. So it's not enough if you don't kill the people, the next best thing to do is eradicate lifeways, right? Systematically destroy language, culture. It's known as ethnocide, which is actually, if you look at the UN definition of genocide, is part of genocide. And it's designed to eradicate thought ways, how we think, our epistemologies, our way of knowing, all of that. That's also known as epistemicide. So these are the three elements of how it's manifest as these events. The trauma is usually considered collective. So just because a whole community experiences this traumatic event, it's felt at an individual level, obviously, but it's also felt at a larger level. Like I said, because everybody in the community may have been exposed to these traumatic events, it doesn't mean we all have poor mental health. I want to really put that out there. You can be impacted, but be incredibly resilient and move and survive and thrive despite those events. It can have an impact, but it doesn't mean mental health is automatically now bad for everybody. There are many protective factors that make a difference. But here's an example of invisibility, right? So most of us don't hear about American Indian slavery, right? And rightfully we hear about African slavery because I always say US settler colonialism has two flip sides of the same coin. You dispossess people of land, and stolen people. Chattel slavery, these two things walk the path together to uphold these structures. But Native people were part of that story and we don't hear about that, right? So here's just an example of these, and this is a historically traumatic event. Several events. Now, historically traumatic events are not one-off events for people. Quite often, there are several historically traumatic events for groups that are targeted in the United States. So if we were to add up all the Indian slaves taken in the New World from the time of Columbus to the end of the 19th century, we have estimates of about 5 million Native slaves. Now, how do we know that? You know, my tribe was decimated by slavery. Choctaws were raided by Chickasaws and sold to the Goose Creek men, and we were sold into slavery to where? Cuba, Haiti, and Puerto Rico. Now, a lot of people don't know that. Now, the funny thing is, I did do DNA one time because I was kind of curious to see what else was happening. I was looking actually for the white side of my family, where they're from on certain things. I came up Cuban. Okay, I know I am not Cuban. I have no Cuban ancestry, no Cuban related relatives, but that was legacy of Choctaw enslavement. So that means I'm sharing some genetic material with some people who are Cuban. They don't know it, but that's probably Choctaw. Boarding schools. So this is, I heard one of our someone from Australia talking about, yes, you guys are familiar with this. We had it here in Canada, where they were known as residential schools. We were forcibly removed and put into boarding schools as a way to kill the Indian to save the man. And you could see how young these children were removed and put in. This is a serious historically traumatic event. I'm raising this. There's a ton I could talk about. If you want to look at a historical trauma event timeline, look at Native Americans in Philanthropy website. I have a historical trauma timeline on there for them, which gives you all kinds of details on this. But children were removed at very young ages and placed into these systems. And these systems were designed for what? Ethnocide in particular, right? So kids were disproportionately exposed to high levels also of sexual and physical abuse in these systems. This is Tom Torino, a young Navajo man when he first arrived at Carlisle Indian School, and this is him 3 years later. This was used as evidence to support in Australia removal of Aboriginal children as well. Okay, so, but we're still here, okay, despite all of this. And so, so what's the impact of these historically traumatic events on people's well-being? Disruptions in our ability to fulfill our original instructions. When General Sheridan said the best way to kill the Sioux, the Lakota people, was by killing the buffalo, he wasn't thinking, oh, I'm cutting off food supply. He understood that he was disrupting the people's ability to fulfill their teachings around Buffalo Nation. There was a very symbiotic relationship between Buffalo and Lakota peoples that required certain ceremonies and things to be in place. So it was deeper than that, right? So historically traumatic events are designed to disrupt people's ability to fulfill their original instructions as a people. It's also designed to disrupt relational ways of being in the world. This is really important because when you talk about community engagement and dealing with communities coming together and dealing with issues around activism and social justice, 99% of what you're dealing with is disconnection. And for us, connectedness really matters. Remember, I just told you I'm connected to future generations, past generations. Right now, that's my place of power. So relational ways of being in the world were purposefully disrupted. When you put kids in boarding schools and raise them by a system, you've disrupted their relational way of being to their parents, even to their bodies. You weren't allowed to hug in boarding school, even your sibling. You weren't allowed to touch. A generation of children were not allowed to touch, right? So relational ways of being. Third element that was broken down is how we talk about ourselves, our narrative processes, and that was part of it. So what do? Is we have to address those three areas. We have to build original instructions back into place. We have to create interventions that are about restoring relational ways of being in the world and narrative transformative strategies. Let me see, there's no clock. How am I doing on time? So I can just do a time check. Okay. All right, so when I talk about original structures, I'm just going to give you one real quick example here. So you might think, well, what are these original instructions and how does that tie in to creating better health and wellness for our communities? Well, I'll give you a brief example. I'll give you the comic book version of a Choctaw one because it would take 3 days telling. But in our ancient stories, we have a story that says Hashkanaya, she's the moon, and Hashi is the sun. And Hashi and Hashkanaya shared the sky together. And back then it was beautiful, bright together. They shared that sky. And they had their star children. All the stars were their children. And you know how the sun, you've been reading about these geomagnetic storms with the sun flares. Now the sun does that sometimes, right? Sends out these flares that can come as far away as Earth, and we can get hit with them. Well, Hashkanaya saw that, and she told Hashi, she said, none of your flares should ever hit me or touch me or any of our children, because if it does, I'm leaving. And Hashi said, oh, absolutely not. Never would I do that. Well, one day, Hashi got a little upset about something and threw out a flare, and it hit Hashkanaya. And that day she said, I'm sorry, I love you, but this is the rules. And she took all her star children and went to the other side of the world. That's how we have night and day. And she said, but I love you, but this is what has to be done. But one morning, once a month, we can share the morning sky together and we can talk. And there's one day a month, you notice that the moon and sun are together in the early morning. We had domestic violence prevention in ancient Choctaw times. That is a domestic violence prevention message. It gave us clear boundaries of expectations of what's okay and what's not okay. And the woman because we were a matriarchal society, had the authority to take care of her family immediately if something got out of line. You know, we used to put men's moccasins just outside the door. Bye, go back to mom. It wasn't tolerated. That's an example of a story that we would take and then begin to develop an intervention around. But we had those teachings. Just a real quick one on relational. Depression. So if you've been in the system a really long time, clients who've been in the system, Native clients who've been in the system a really long time, in mental health systems, all clients for that matter, are socialized to become dependent on the system. And they also are socialized into the language of the system. And it's manifest quite often in intake, right? So Eduardo Duran shares this story, so I'm going to share his story on this, which I think also shows the role of Indian humor, because humor is medicine too. But he'll ask a client who's been in the system for a really long time, tell me a little bit about yourself. And quite often they don't start with their name. They start off with, well, you know, I'm depressed. And he goes, oh, I see. Okay. Tell me about that naming ceremony when your mother named you depressed. And the client's like, wait a minute, I'm not depressed. No. He said, no. You told me something very important about yourself. Clearly there was an important naming ceremony. You received the name depressed. Tell me about how that happened. And by now the client's like, this is a little wacky. And he said, well, you know, that ceremony, usually social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, all these important, they have a big council, a grand council. Sometimes it's on a oblong table, sometimes luckily a circle table, but usually they come together around a conference table, and there's a sacred book called the DSM. And they all gather together and they all have this conversation, and then they open that book and they say, his or her name shall be depressed. Is that how you got your name? By then the client's like, oh, okay. And then he takes it one step. Now, why is that important? Because naming, from our traditional point of view, this is a relational way of thinking. Naming, when we receive a name, we take on not only the characteristics of that name is a reflection of who we are, but it also tells us how to behave in the world. It tells us how the community should respond to us and how we should respond to community. It gives us a set of obligations and behavioral responsibilities. So when you accept a name, so, you know, you think about it. So what Ed was starting to do is to say, you've taken a name inside of you, but actually this is something that visits you. So now he'll take it another step further. When does depression visit you? Now, why does he do that? Because for two reasons. One is you have a relationship with this disease. And what is disease from a Native point of view? Just being out of balance, dis-ease, right? You are not your dis-ease, right? You know, most people with cancer don't say I'm cancer unless that's their zodiac sign, right? Right? They say I have a relationship with I'm living with cancer. It's a relational way of saying it. Mental health, we don't do that as much. Quite often we box people into being their state. And so from a Native point of view, we want to shift that a little bit. We say, well, what's your relationship to the spirit of depression? Does it talk to you in the middle of the night? Does it wake you up? You know, when does it bother you? And when you have a relationship with something, what can you do? Yeah, you could break up. You actually get an opportunity to set boundaries. So now you have that's a relational way of thinking. Okay. Narrative transformer, that's also narrative transformational too, because now you're not your disease, but you're living with something that's not healthy that you need to shift and have a different relationship to. Doesn't mean you get rid of it right away. If you've had a long relationship to depression, it might be something you have a relationship with maybe the rest of your life, but how you manage that, how you address that is what matters. So those are examples from a Native point of view. Okay, so let's fast forward. Just so you know, I've done research on this. So this is just a quick slide to say, we wanted to look and say, if you statistically controlled for people's exposure to other kinds of traumas, sexual trauma in their lifetime, veterans and war violence, all that kind of stuff. If we hold all those traumas aside, even your own historically traumatic event exposure, because you could have experienced something in this lifetime, can we still see an impact of previous generations historically traumatic event exposure on contemporary mental health. We did. We found that there is some relationship there in terms of PTSD and substance use in particular. Okay, so let me go to the third element because I'm running out of time. The wind. For us, wind is a power, is transformational. Our story actually about tornado is a very powerful story. She's a she. And it's actually a story of trauma and recovery. Apanakpala, she was, this comes from my colleague, Michelle Johnson Jennings. It's a story in her family. And Apanakpala was once a great warrior. She's a hunter. And she had to take over the care of her family, her brother, her little brother, because they were both orphaned. And so she was known for her great hunting prowess. And one day she went into the woods to go hunt, and she did not return. And the brother got very nervous and upset because a horrible storm came, and their first tornado they'd ever seen came and wiped out a whole village. And he went in search of his sister, panicked that something had happened awful to her. And he heard crying in the trees up in a hollow of a tree. And it was his sister. She was up in a hollow of a tree. And he said, you know, are you okay? What's happening? And she said, stay away, stay away. I've transformed into the spirit of the wind. And he's like, what are you saying? What's happening? And she said, I don't know what's happening. I'm very upset. I'm very hurt. And he said, what happened? And she said, when I came here into the woods, the village over, a group of men raped me. And my rage was so big that I turned into the wind, and I wiped out their village. So please stay away, stay away. And he said, what can I do to help you? You know, and she said, just here, she transferred all her hunting powers to him. And she said, I don't know, I need to figure out a way to heal. And so he went back into the villages, and he got really well known for his hunting prowess. And he came back and he said, sister, what can I do to help you? And she said, I'm getting lonely. I'm getting lonely, and I feel like I need to heal. I don't know what to do. And he said, let me bring back a partner for you, a life mate for you. Maybe that will help you heal. And she said, okay, that's good. Bring me somebody. So he went back to the village, and because he was pretty well known, because he was quite the hunter, he asked for the hand of a woman there. And when he left with her, he says, by the way, here's the deal. My sister is the one who actually needs the partner. If it's agreeable to you and if it's a match, would you be interested? And she said, sure. So she went and met Apanukpala, and they fell in love. And through that process, Apanukpala healed. And over time, I'm telling you a very shortened version of it. Over time, her transformative power from anger and rage came to transformative power of rebirthing and regeneration, where she clears the fields, and she clears and regenerates in that way. And she gave instruction to the Choctaws how to let her know when she's coming to not hit their village. So we have a whole set of ceremonies that we do so that we let Apanukpala know that we've been practicing well and living well. Those are great original instructions. And also tell something about our two-spirit LGBTQ folks. You have a place. You belong. Okay, so all that to say, decolonization. So it's not about a metaphor for me. It's really about how do we engage this, and that has to do with relationship to land. And I'm going to talk about the approach as land-based healing is one of I'm a big advocate of that, getting outside of services that are traditional and back to the land. And it also involves honoring Indigenous sovereignty. And I'm not talking about just taking Western approaches and adding Indigenous, like slapping a medicine wheel onto it and calling it good. Because when you just add Indigenous knowledge to Western systems, you're not going to get a natural synthesis. And the Western systems quite often end up still being the primary way of operating, right? So these two things have to really be truly on equal footing, or centering Indigenous knowledges, which I prefer, and then pulling in the Western tools that are in Western systems of knowledge that are helpful. And I want to point that out. All systems of knowledge are helpful. They could be helpful. It's how you relate to them that matters, whether they're going to be helpful or hurtful, right? Indigenous people, we've always shared knowledges. We've shared teachings. That's nothing new. In our villages, when other strangers came into our communities, the grandmothers gathered around and said, oh, what do you have? Okay, I'll take that. No, I don't want that, because it was on our terms. It's the same thing. in terms of interventions and thinking about that. So I had a big paradigm shift that happened to me that helped me think about moving away from historical trauma in a different way and shifting it. And it came from a Hawaiian elder. And I overheard him talking. I heard him talking once, Kekalua Perry. And he said, have you heard about the saying crabs in the bucket? Is that familiar? It may not be familiar outside of the US context. When fishermen crab, when they go to get crabs, they put crabs in a bucket because crabs will not let other crabs crawl out of the bucket. They pull them back down. So they all stay in the bucket. And quite often that's used as a metaphor for lateral violence in our communities, right? Just as when someone's coming up, we pull each other back down, all right? And so Perry said, you know, when did we accept this as crab behavior? And I was like, wait, what? Yeah, do crabs naturally do, like, what is crab natural behavior? Because see, if I was a social worker in this bucket, if I was a crab social worker in this bucket, I'd be like, come on, crabbies, let's get together. We can lift each other up. We can do it. Social justice, social action right now. Don't believe what they say about. But here's the problem. I realize I've been restricting my thinking to the bucket. That started defining my thinking about historical trauma, about everything. And I started realizing, wait a minute, that bucket does not define crab behavior. Kekalua pointed that out. He said, you know, what's natural crab behavior? Do you know when crabs are in their natural environment, when they have a healthy system, when they have a healthy environment, they pull each other up onto rocks. That's crab behavior. Historical trauma is the bucket. Settler colonialism is the bucket, but we cannot allow that to define how we understand human behavior. So when we think about developing interventions, we think about changing the environment, right? If we have a healthy environment, healthy behaviors emerge. When we have an unhealthy environment, those unhealthy environments, it was like, it sounds kind of basic, but I had a big aha moment that I realized I had gotten too defined by the bucket. In social work, we tend to do that a lot because as social workers, we're defined by programs and policies and systems that get caught up into creating buckets. And so I just want us to think about that. And Einstein helps me with that. Einstein said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So we have to think outside the box a bit. And so I try to do that with this project, Yappalli, and this gave me a chance to work finally with my tribe. So I'm going to end with this part. And this is fire. And for us, fire is very sacred. Fire is literally sun on earth. It's literally, we say, as long as our fires continue to burn, we will live as a people. So we can't allow that sacred fire to be extinguished. So honoring our responsibilities through implementing these elements, right? So how did we do this? Well, this is myself and Dr. Michelle Johnson Jennings. We're both Choctaw. We had a chance to do this project. I pulled her in to do with me. And we wanted to look to our ancestors to help our people's health. My tribe came to me and said that, you know, we're dealing with a situation where 1 out of 3 of our Choctaw children are going to be, 1 out of 3 are going to have type 2 diabetes by 2050. 1 out of 3. 70% of our community are obese, not just overweight, but obese. Okay. He said, we are in a time where our grandparents and parents are going to outlive the children. And he goes, I just have to stop that train. I don't know how to stop that train. We've thrown everything at it that we can. We've created the best we've created new walkways. They've done the structural interventions. They changed the diets at all the tribal venues and the menus. They created beautiful gyms that rivals Gold's Gym. Seriously, we have the best gyms in the world, right? We have gorgeous gyms in our communities for free, right? They created great services even down to the individual level. I mean, from behavioral health all the way to you know, the stomach, gastrointestinal work, everything to address this. And less than 3% change happened. because we're always saying go upstream. And then they went all the way behavioral, but still no change. And he said, I don't know what to do at this point. What do you think's going on? And I said, well, maybe some of those changes, we'll see the impact on population health a little bit further down the line. I said, but what do you think's happening? And he said, I feel like there's a grief. There's something that we haven't dealt with. And when I went to visit, what I realized is that 30% of people who are accessing services, because that's really all who accesses services in my tribe, 30% benefited. They were doing better at the gym, they're getting buff, they're doing okay, they're going to the gyms. But the 70% of the people who are driving the population health numbers that we see that don't look good are not going to services and not getting help until it's too late, until people are really sick. So what can we do to bring them in? And so he said, I really want us to do something more culturally focused. I don't know what that could be. And so he said, so can you help us? I was like, that was a big task, a big tall order. And so we put our mind and spirit together with the chief's sister. And we couldn't have done this without having the support of the chief and the chief's sister, I just have to say. We said, well, what can we do? And right now, the current models that are out there for developing our health and health promotion, and the two areas that they really wanted to focus on was substance use and obesity prevention in particular. We're primarily Western based, and our tribe was already doing it pretty well, and they had already indigenized it to some degree. So we knew we had to approach it differently, and we knew that we had to create our own. So we decided that we wanted to rewalk the Trail of Tears. I'm not kidding. This is what we decided to do, that we ourselves as investigators and behavioral health practitioners, we were going to rewalk the Trail of Tears, to walk in the footsteps of our ancestors, to actually come up with a health promotion model that would be inspired from that walk and what we want to look at. So we went back to the tribe and proposed that to them. And they were like, okay, you can do it, but you have to do it in June. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the United States, walking through Arkansas in the middle of June, it's, I don't know how to translate this into centigrade, but it's about 100 to 110 degrees. So it's really hot and humid, and all the bugs that we have and all the snakes, and Arkansas is very swampy. So this is our routes of removal. The federal government under Andrew Jackson decided to remove us from our territory here, this area, and we had to walk all the way to here, which is now Choctaw Nation. Choctaw Nation is bigger than the state of Massachusetts. Our reservation is bigger than the state of Massachusetts. People don't realize that here. So this is Oklahoma. This is where my tribe is. And that's our Choctaw lands. And that's our where we were removed to. Now, the neat thing is when we were removed, we actually, just to give you a background, we actually maintained our traditional names and actually even our kind of clan relationships as much as we could. So Mashallah Tabi, who's my relation, we settled mostly in here in Puxanabi and Pushmataha. So we still have actually traditional names for a lot of these areas that we still use. Actually, names like Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that's a Choctaw word, means black warrior. Oklahoma is a Choctaw word, means red people. Okay. Okay, so we got together and we said, well, how are we going to do this? And there were a couple of things that we said we wanted to focus on. We wanted to build on our original instructions. We wanted to build on relational restoration. We wanted to do narrative transformation. But we wanted to do something really different. We wanted to focus on a project that would have community sustainability at its core. And we said, we're not going to do this through services. The tribe's like, wait, what? I said, nope, because we've spent too much time on doing our cultural, where we've imported, people are now going to services to get culture. And that's not healthy. Services should be culturally grounded and culturally centered, but that's not where we go to get culture. Culture is in the community, is in our families. That's what we need to grow, new cultural approaches. It was funny, he said, you could take, this is great, you could take kids with you and you can, on each day of the walk, because we're going to do a 10-day walk, because if we really did the full walk, it would take 6 months, by the way, to a year. So we were going to do that. But we wanted to make sure that we walked on average the same amount of time our ancestors walked. So We were walking 8 to 15 miles a day. We walked exactly on the trail routes that we could find that were still intact. And we camped in the same clan encampments where our clans came together, which put us in very strange places like wildlife refuges and stuff like that. But we found those places and we camped there over the course of the 10 days. And the elder said, you know, this is great. You guys can take the kids and you can do substance abuse. Each day could be thought of about doing substance abuse prevention or suicide prevention. And we said, no, we're flipping the script. This is not about that. I said, this is what we're trying to decolonize and get ourselves out of. I said, we've got great programs to address that. What we need to do instead is say, instead of substance abuse prevention, what is our original instructions around medicines? And when we get out of balance with medicines, that what's the corrective action? Instead of suicide prevention, what's our teachings around life and living? And we get out of balance with that, how do we take corrective action, right? Different way of flipping the script and thinking about it. Okay, so we walked over 200, almost 300 miles as part of this pilot. We did 2 pilots. And one of the things that were the other element, I talked about these 2 already, but meeting the medicine halfway. Our teaching says you can't ask for something. So we knew culturally that we can go out and do this, but still not come away with anything other than blistered feet and an experience. We may not come up with a health but so we knew that we had to meet the medicine halfway. So we say in our traditions, and this is the decolonized approach to services, right? You know, like I said, dependency on services means our clients sit back and get served, right? But in Native point of view, that is not going to invoke the power of that medicine. You have to meet the medicine halfway to make that work. So we knew we had to go out there and put ourselves into this. Little different way to create an intervention. Here's my tribal grounds. There I am. I made some moccasins, was walking on the trail on that. It's definitely community-based participatory research. We started with a simple question: what's the Choctaw road to health? What's our road to health? What does that look like? We did archival research. We did GIS mapping. We went back to the Smithsonian. I held my by chance, when I opened up the box of commutation papers for our removal, I picked up the first stack and I opened it up. It was my direct ancestor. And I like wept. I was like, he touched this, you know, so it was very emotional. And I have to tell you, it was worse than I imagined. When I read the diaries of the white guys who did this, they were troubled. They were deeply troubled by, some of them were very deeply troubled by what they were being asked or required to do. Very disturbed. And so I read very disturbing stories about, so I descend from one group that literally got lost in the swamps of Lake Providence. One white guy didn't know where he was going, took our people in the wrong direction. We were 30 days in waist high, most of the time in waist high mud and swamp and water. And our children died along the way. And there's documentation of us literally carrying our dead babies because we wouldn't leave them behind. So, you know, it was tough. But we also looked at what were some of our instructions that our ancestors left for us. What were the words that they said that they wanted us to live by for future generations that we wanted to connect to? It turned out by accident, not really, by providence, I guess. It was a women-led project. And we went to the elders. We're like, only women are coming forward to do this with us. We started putting the information out. And they said, that's fine. So what was really neat is when you really do community engaged research or projects or services, the stories come out. The stories of survival, of thrivance, of well-being come out. And the community said, the elders told us, listen, women were responsible historically in our tribe for correcting and doing the ceremonies to reestablish balance and well-being. Of course, the women are leading this. That makes sense. Go ahead. You have our blessing, right? Now, it's a little different kind of research because I was a participant as much as I was a researcher. So that's a little different. And for those of you who are interested in that, I could talk about that. We even documented dreams. We journaled. We did all kinds of things. We incorporated Choctaw principles from the very beginning of how we were going to behave with each other and with the community. And we talked about that openly. We used our language. Every day we wanted to use our language. It didn't matter how far I'm an adult language learner. My grandfather spoke the language, but I wasn't raised with it. So I was committed to doing that. And our elder said, one of the elders spoke, and she told me, you learn. So that was it. I had to learn. But these principles also helped us get through. Oh, by the way, these are all pictures of the trail in the background. So you see how swampy it is? Okay, can I just tell you, for those of you who are doing research, the IRB nightmare this was? Because we weren't allowed to take anyone under the age of 12, because if you got bit by a water moccasin, you had to be able to survive, which is a type of snake. For those who are Aboriginal in Australia, you know how that is with all of the critters. We got like stuff like that out there. And this is why it's important to talk directly to community members, especially first language speakers. We asked one of the elders there. So we went to the tribe. We said, we want to know what deep listening really means from a tribal perspective. And the tribe said, oh yeah, the word for that is haklo. It means to listen. Okay, well, that's lovely. But then we went to an elder and we said, Grandma, what does haklo mean? And these are her words. What is said may be very important to your life. Listen, haklo is to remember that the medicine given to us is still out there. We have just forgotten to listen for it. It is to be at peace with oneself, to be quiet and soft in spirit, to stop trying to outspeak others, to hear and communicate, to understand. It's about sharing from the spirit and taking the time to honor another human being. That's haklo. Right? That's very different than to say, oh, that means just to listen. So you go to those first language speakers, go to those people who are those knowledge keepers. They could tell you. We also incorporated ceremony. And my poor doctoral students who went through this with me, I told them, you guys have to abstain from alcohol or drugs or whatever you're doing for at least a month before going on this, if you want to go on this. And they're like, what? Like, well, that's your choice. But that's the rules, because if we're going to ask for receiving this information in a spiritual way, as well as we need to be as healthy and clean and open as we can. And so they did. Not everyone fasted. But I did. I did fasting. The elders had a sweat lodge on Choctaw land to get us started in a good way. So there was a ceremonial aspect of this. And we realized that this is a relationship, right? You don't just go to the mountain. Our medicine people didn't just go to the mountain and go, okay, God, I'm here. Give me the knowledge. That's not how it works. You can climb that mountain. You can fast. You can have a really hard time. It could be really difficult, but the timing's not right. The knowledge isn't meant for you. And that's okay. That's a very different point of view than Western ideas of knowledge, where knowledge is for the taking. For us, it's relational. It may or may not be. How I approach that knowledge matters just as much as whether or not that knowledge is meant for me, right? Okay, so we did create a curriculum to start with. We did qualitative data gathering on the trail. We did focus groups on the trail. I would never do that again. Let me just tell you, we sound crazy. When you do this kind of work in community, the stories come out. For example, the elders told us, family stories came out that, for us, leaving the bones behind of our ancestors was very traumatic. We have ancient stories where we've removed before. That's the other thing. Our tribes, our peoples have had hard times before, and we had ways of coping and addressing that. And so we heard the stories about when we carried the bones of our ancestors on our first removal. So we knew about that, but our tribe was very distressed about leaving our bones behind. And so some of the grandmothers actually ground bones and sewed them into the hems of their skirts to ensure their ancestors came with them. Like, you heard stories like that. We were given pedometers. We did a blog so community could follow us. We were given cameras. We had, especially the youth, do digital stories who went with us. And here's just some of the pictures, just to give you, and then I'm just going to close. Here's some of the families. We had parent, child, youth pairs on this. This is how deep. This is actually not erosion only. This is how deep the trail was carved out from one of the areas of Arkansas that we walked through. Songs came to us. Yes, we dealt with some racism there. That's what we woke up to at a camp across from us the next morning. We're like, okay, we're moving camp. Laughter is medicine. That's important too. That's an important thing. So going out into the land and into the community, the reason why this was so critical is you can't stay in the trauma. You can't stay in the tears for long. And it was actually important for us to recognize that. There was one place where we went to where we burst out in laughter and joy. And the non-natives who went with us, or we had natives who weren't Choctaw who went with us as part of the documentation, they were weeping while we were crying. They thought we were irreverent Choctaws. They're like, what's wrong with you people? Their people died here. we're laughing because we feel their joy here. We feel they had shade here and they had protection. We feel they did okay. They survived here, right here. And then I remembered when my great grandmother, she was born right after a couple of months after they arrived at Fort Towson. They made love on the trail. We talked about that. They loved, despite all of that. They persisted. So we got connected to that and realized our laughter is part of it. Anyway, so relationship to land, to self. You can read the articles if you want to. There's some articles out on this project now and the importance of being on the land. The young person who went with us said something. She got it when we were out there. She had a hard night. She had a really hard day. And she just said the next morning, she said, okay, I get it now. I heal others when I keep or make myself healthy. She said that. And we're like, okay, our work is done. You know, by the way, she's gone on to get her master's in public health. Now, she was only 12 at the time. This was our Choctaw specific model that we ended up coming up with that was based on our ancient clan systems. And so we created a program that is a 12-week program that basically takes us through the different aspects of our clans and societies and what the responsibilities were and how that starts with our individual behavior and moves to community and teaching political organizing and organizing. So what we decided is we wanted to do this for Native women, but this isn't about a substance abuse prevention project or obesity prevention project, although it is. It's actually about creating community-based health leaders, people to stand up by first starting with themselves, that they're going to make themselves available so that each of these people end up in having these health societies that we are kind of starting back up in our communities so that if there's a overdose in one community, for example, all the women who are with the White Crane Society will call all the other women of the White Crane Society to come forward to do a prevention event at the local level. And that's what we're doing. We're basically training ourselves to be our cultural selves and responsibility to each other. For grant purposes, I had to translate this into a model that they understand. That's okay. And then then we went and did another pilot to test the curriculum. That's Michelle and I on the trail. And then so now we just finished the 5 years, actually it's turned into 7 years with COVID of doing this project. 150 women were trained or went through this program, 30 women per 5 districts trained in this model. It's a health leadership model. At the end of the 12-week intervention, 12 session, I should say, it's not 12 week, 12 session intervention, they're given a pot of money. And we have booster sessions for the remainder of the year to create community-based events that will be sustainable. So they actually have impact at the community level. So we have women, for example, there's a group called Walking Warriors on Facebook, if you ever see them. They're from this. And now they're actually having Native women from all over the country who are doing their workouts and walking together. So they have to do sustainable interventions that will continue, that doesn't require a lot of money other than maybe $500. You know, that's literally, we kept it at that low level. I could tell you, I can't technically present it yet because I have to get permission from my tribe, but I can tell you it worked. Very excited. Yeah, so getting people on the land. So what worked for them was after that curriculum, we had them do a 10-day walk on the Trail of Tears, and that punctuated it for everybody. Because when they walked in the footsteps of their ancestors, when they got into the land-based aspects of this, they were like, this is real. I'm getting off the, what one said, I'm getting off of the pity pot. because my ancestor did this for me. I have to do this for the next generations. And so we're pretty excited and look for the publications on that. Doctoral students can ask me about that. So these are the guiding questions. And I encourage you to ask these kind of questions of yourselves and the communities you're working with. What kind of ancestor did my ancestors envision me to be? What kind of ancestor do I want to be? What kind of ancestor do I want to envision future generations to be? Those are the questions that guided all core components of our curriculum. Yep, and that's it. So that's us. We can't take pictures of looking forward because of protection, but this is us walking into the community. The community holds a big feast for them, recognize them as community health leaders. They know that they're the women that people can go to help with some of these issues. And we went from, for example, people having 2 cases of soda per day to none. Some people never had veggies in their life other than lettuce on their or ketchup. That was new. Went from 1,000 steps to walking 10 miles a day. 3 liters away of water. They learned how to mobilize community action. And we do have some, improved physical activity levels, lowered food addictive behaviors, as well as lowered substance, mostly alcohol use. So we were very excited about this, and we've just got funded to do a youth version of this called Wakaya. And again, talking about the language, the elders always say you have to, if you're working with someone, if you're working with children, you have to think like a child. If you're working with an elder, you have to think like an elder. You have to find that common language, that common ground. You have to literally transform and be at that language level. And for youth, we call the program Wakaya. In our language, that means to rise up. Wakaya, rise up, be strong. It also means get off your ass. So of course, as a slang, so the youth like that. Ooh. So we're doing that now. So yeah, that's it. So I'll end on that and say thank you for allowing me to share a little bit about what we've been doing. Yeah.
One that I was thinking about, like related to the journey, the walk, we shared kind of some of those like physical and health outcomes. Given that we are like a global group and a lot of people come across borders, traveling, some people traveling for the first time for us to get here. I was curious, like what the impact, like across the board.
Yeah, great question. Great question. A young woman named Chiwang was with us. She's from the Truku tribe in Taiwan. And we wanted to make sure we had an international Indigenous presence with us as well. And actually my colleague who's Yaqui also came with us. And the reason for that was because we're so caught up in our Choctaw specific way of looking at the world. We wanted to also see what other people saw about what we were experiencing and how that impacted them and their thinking. Chiwang was so motivated after she actually went on the first pilot study with us. She actually got bit by a reckless spider. I'm like, no, but it was fine. That she was so motivated by the rewalking of the trail component of it, that she went back to her people because they have a sacred mountain that actually is getting mined and is starting to collapse because of the mining. So they've been she's been an activist in her tribe to save the mountain. So she actually went back and spoke with her elders about the project, and they created their own walk to rewalk. And it's not these rewalking isn't about memorializing the trauma, but reconnecting again to life, the vision of life and health, and creating programs and practices out of that. And I had a chance to go back since then to go meet with the elders there to see what they were doing. And so they're doing it, they're implementing it at the local level with young people. And again, getting them reconnected to their life and health ways that are tied to land and place. That's exciting. The Homa Nation also got excited about our project, and Dr. Shannon Dora Billiot, who is another social worker, led, and Michelle Johnson Jennings and I had a role in this project as well, but it's Shannon Dora's project with her people. And because they're losing so much land with climate change and the impact that they're having, they decided to retrace sacred waterways and certain kinds of areas to start reclaiming and their health to address primarily diabetes. But she's also looking at different ways to implement this around environmental health and well-being as well. So I think there's a lot of things about, around the world, our Indigenous people understand that relationship to land and place and how powerful that is. And anytime you get a chance to reconnect to the land, you get it said, I am the land is me. You get a chance to connect to yourself and what that means in terms of health and well-being. So land-based, I think we underutilize land-based opportunities, land-based healing approaches. I would really encourage us to think about that, especially as climate change is happening and our communities are being forced into new areas and having to leave land, that has an impact on our well-being too. Yeah, so hopefully other groups will do it. I can certainly think Aboriginal communities could be doing something very similar, and the Sami and I think there's anyone here from Finland or any of those places. Yeah. So there's Indigenous people around the world, wherever we are. So. Thank you for nodding. Yeah. Thank you for asking. And yes, it's okay. I appreciate the ask. Yeah. Why, it's this bridge called my back, right? I think about Gloria Anzaldúa. We're Shri Moraga, all that, we quite often are in a position of being the bridge and having to do dual translation back and forth. And that's part of the role that I accepted, I think, when I went and got my PhD. And Dr. Rosina Becerra, I want to acknowledge, was I would not be here without her. She believed in me at a time when I certainly was not believing in myself, and made me who I am today in academia. So I'm grateful. I think as an Indigenous person, we're in the United States, so I don't have an illusion that, I'm not devastated when something goes wrong in this system, because I expect it. Because I'm like, we are living in a US settler colonial society. I'm not surprised. I choose my moments when to take action, and I choose moments to sit back and I acknowledge it, but I don't internalize it. And I think that's really important. That's part of how I survived. So I'm not devastated. If every minute of my day, I told Rosina this, she didn't know, I hadn't expressed this to her. My first moment walking, my first job was at Columbia University on faculty. I walked in the door, I was greeted by a tenured senior professor who literally told me on my first day of work, the only reason we hired you is because you're American Indian. Well, I could have, what? Am I going to let that define my experience? I'm like, yeah, bring it on. I'm like, I'm here now, man. Got me now. I'm at the institution that would never have accepted me. Ha! And I'm teaching. So a little bit of that warrior spirit lives in me. But it also puts a burden on us, right? We got to outperform. We got to be out better. We got to do this and that. So I've kind of overcompensated in some situations, and I got to watch my health and mental health with respect to that. But I think the key is recognizing that I've chosen to be a bridge in some of these circumstances. The challenge was, from the community end, when I explained this project to the elders at HOMA, they're like, that sounds great, but what's the research? I'm like, that is the research. You know, because Baton Rouge in Louisiana. You know what that is? Think about it in French. Baton Rouge. Who's French? I heard someone speaking French or has French language, right? What does that mean? That's right. Baton Rouge, red stick. It's the place that the Homa, the boundary line that the Homa had in place between their world and the outside world. And I said to her, what my idea was, I said, I think you guys need to go back and replant the red stick. And through that process, you'll figure it out. So, you know, you don't get used to being in the in-between, but I think that partly you learn how to navigate it. And I just had to learn how to translate what we're doing culturally to a Western understanding to get funded on the funding end. And like I said, there are tools that are helpful. I use the IMB model, information, motivation, behavior, change model, to help the reviewers. I said, here's our Choctaw specific clans. They're like, okay, that's lovely. What is that? You know, they didn't quite understand that. But I said, but guess what? That information, this culturally specific information, is what's going to motivate behavioral change. And then they're like, oh, okay. It's not about just taking a pill. Now I'm going to be motivated because now we know how well that works, right? We take my vitamin and then I'll feel better. Human beings are a lot more complex than that. So we said, you know, it has to be rooted in these indigenous knowledges, and that includes teachings, relational ways of being in the world, how we talk and think about ourselves. And then they got it. So it's just a way of figuring out a way to translate and use a tool that can be helpful to us, but still on our terms. Does that make sense? Yeah, yeah. Don't throw everything out. If something works, for example, some behavioral approaches really do work. But you know, just make sure you've got at that foundation with that cultural factor, what those cultural pieces are. I know, I'm sorry. Take a. Oh, over here. Mm. Well, you know, honestly, you know what approach? Well, storytelling, lots of storytelling, but more of a narrative approach, I would say. But when we actually went to analyze some of the data, I used Gilligan's listening guide, and I felt I liked it because it's basically how do you read between the lines to pull out. There's a whole process. There's like 4-step process of listening to the data and pulling out the story from the data. And one aspect of those listenings is you take out all the I statements and you pull it out and you create what she calls an I poem, which gives you another way of looking at the data. Like how do people position themselves in relation to the topic? I took it a next step, which I said, well, we don't always think in I, and we don't talk in I, we talk in we. And so then I was interested in looking at the we statements, as well as the I statements, and see where there was overlap and where there was differences. And it created a very robust way of women describing their experience that kind of punctuated some of the stuff we're looking at. So the biggest thing that women said is it's transformational. They said it's transformational, and that they felt so many of them physically would say go like this. They're like, there's no words being there. So I honestly, I'll look at the data now. We're analyzing the final runs, but one of the things I'm interested in is to see if there was really a difference between those who completed the full 10-day the walk versus there's some who couldn't because of health reasons. They couldn't go on the walk. And I'm just wondering if they didn't get as much out of the experience, because I think actually being on the land and being where literally in the footsteps of your ancestors and hearing the stories of what they went through is really very powerful. Yeah, but qualitative is mostly narrative approaches. Testimonials is another way of thinking about it too, how people talk about something to carry into the future, what they want to leave for the next generation. So some of the older women talked about, you can analyze it from that perspective as well. Thoughts? All right. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. And don't forget my